Deontic contextualism, utilitarianism without overpopulation. Earth is spatially limited, and thus land constitutes a scarcity. Continual increase in population will have thus increased its density until overpopulation. The repugnant argument against utilitarianism is applied to this problem as put forward by Derek Parfit. People in overpopulated environment has lower individual welfare than otherwise. Yet, if the collective welfare of such overpopulation outweighs that of a normal population in virtue of a sufficiently large number of bearers of welfare, ignoring the interaction between the individual and the collective, then utilitarianism seems to always obligate overpopulation because simply of a larger sum of total welfare. However, on my Deontic contextualism, it doesn't always obligate overpopulation. Actions are performed in some Deontic context at any given time, and the Deontic context depends on facts and values at that time. The situation one is in and the preferences one had at the time. Of course, it doesn't commit me to a value theory that gives up an objective goodness that outruns one's preference, but people have preference change across time. So it makes a difference to when people make decisions. On the other hand, facts and ontology, what there is, the dependence on what the actual world is makes difference to how we are to think about issues such as population. So with a theory of mere possibility that within an ontological necessitarianism on which objects exist in all possible worlds, in a real domain, in a real context, but it roughly put on a certain logic of existence. We work with a constant domain across possible worlds. And on the other hand, with a theory of fictitious possibility that I propose in understanding Wittgensteinian nonsense, very roughly put, it's a fictitious possibility that that water is constituted by other chemical structures such as H2O2. So that's the possibility that it has a certain illusion of possibility before the discovery of its chemical structure. But of course, to use Putnam's own example would be X, Y, Z. But these possibility is not real. And so with this theory of mere and fictitious possibility, I describe the asymmetry between transitioning into a world with more concrete persons and one into less. And so because we're talking about situationality of making decisions, transitioning from a world with a certain amount of concrete persons into one with less, and in contrast, transitioning from one with less to one with more, there's a difference. And okay, so although we sometimes ought to have preferred a world with more concrete persons with bare lives to one with less, as half it points out to be a problem with utilitarianism. But that's when we're making the decision in a Deontic context in which all such persons are concrete. Because then we would be transitioning from a world which with more concrete persons with bare lives into one with less, even if those people would lead a slightly better life. On the other hand, we ought not have preferred a world with more concrete persons with bare life to one with less in a Deontic context in which some such persons are not concrete and thus merely possible. On that note, because there are persons that the notion of merely possible persons, in contrast to future persons, that there's how the actual world is makes a difference. And the ontological necessitarianism and its interaction with actualism, I've also discussed that elsewhere. I roughly put again, if naturalism is restricts what there is about natural kinds, then we can. It's indeed possible that the earth is covered completely with water, such that no animals like bipeds like we are would have evolved. And putatively, there's no such natural kind. If the other alternative would have generated an ontology with many various life forms that hasn't actually been. So that's one way to understand the how the actual world interact with an ontology that whose logic has a constant domain. So the welfare, okay, so and to go on, the welfare of those persons to have become concrete in a non-actual future is fictitious because they are not actually concrete. They're concrete in a non-actual future. And merely possible persons are not persons. So there's an object that could have been a person but isn't. And that's a merely possible person. But persons are, well, this point need to be further argued for, but if this is the case, persons are essentially so. If persons are essentially persons, then on a metaphysical necessity, conception of essence, then persons are metaphysically necessarily persons. So merely possible persons because in the actual world it is not a person, so it's not a person because persons are necessarily persons. There are possible worlds in which the object is not a person, which is the actual world. So it's not a person, but merely possibly person. So, and furthermore, besides the essentialism of personhood, the eternalism of personhood that I would need for the theory to go through would be that anything ever a person eternally is, and that's where it gets confusing. But I'll go on. Persons are concrete through their embodiment, and so very roughly to play a causal role in the world. And thus all persons ever lived. Future persons from a time are persons concrete not at that time, but at some posterior time. Future persons, very simple. The actual world is a determinate object, but it could have been otherwise. So the actual world, there are persons that will be concrete at some future time, but of course, epistemically, we don't know yet, and even metaphysically, it could have been otherwise. The actual world could have been otherwise, but our ignorance doesn't undermine the personhood of such future persons. And of course, another way to understand the eternalism of personhood is that Socrates is now dead. He is no longer embodied. But if there's a way to understand the increase in his welfare, because we're still understanding him better, understanding his philosophy better. So the barrier of welfare and with the welfare that's still changing, that's another merit of such eternalism. Although of course he doesn't have a mind, a brain, and he doesn't have a mind because he doesn't have a brain now, so he would not be happy about the increase in his welfare. But that's an increase in welfare nonetheless. So that's one merit of the theory. So all right. So objects in the domain of the actual world are either actually ever concrete or not, and some merely possibly persons relative to some agents are epistemically possibly persons because of one's ignorance of their never concreteness. And I think a very good case in point is an aborted fetus before the mother's decision. Because once the potential mother knew that she is pregnant, the fetus, before she made any decision, she could have imagined the fetus to have been born and developed into the infant and the child and an adult and imagine him or her or them leading a very good life, but a person leading a good life, but that's not a person, because has she made the decision of abortion, what the content of her thought, imagination would have been different. And before her decision, she would not have known whether the putative person she's imagining is an actual person, because given the actual decision in the actual world, she would the fetus would not have developed into a person. So that's one way to understand the and so it goes with future persons, that and its corresponding epistemic underdetermination. Okay, so the fetus could have been concrete has she made an alternative decision, but given her actual decision, it is not and never would have been. So given her actual decision of abortion, although concreteness possibly instantiates on it, personhood fictitiously so, because if it did, it necessarily does, given the essentiality of personhood. But there are possible worlds in which it does not, such as the actual world. The object actually concrete from a time after some duration upon conception is fictitiously a person. So the object is a concrete fetus, but it is not a person. It is fictitiously a person, because merely possibly a person, but not possibly a person, because not actually one. So to go back to the problem, the repugnant conclusion, transitioning from a world with less persons leading an okay life into one with many, many, many persons leading bare lives, because those persons, given a situation, are not yet concrete, or even not concrete at all, not concrete in the actual world. So that transition, the welfare of those extra persons, even in had that world been actualized, the total welfare would have been larger, higher, but it's different from transitioning from the world already with those persons concrete into the other one. And the first decision, had we not made the decision, those concrete persons' welfare is not real because they are not persons. And that's my proposed response to the repugnant conclusion. So we can have utilitarianism without overpopulation. Thank you very much.